Please, take her. A mother's desperate plea in the snow. Before we start the story, leave a comment telling us which city you're watching from. And at the end, don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Enjoy the story. The snow had swallowed the world. It lay in drifts higher than fences, muffled the sound of hooves, and wrapped the valley in a silence so deep it felt like the earth itself had stopped breathing. In the center of that frozen stillness, Elise Carter stumbled forward, each step sinking into the white void. Her boots were soaked through her thin shawl, stiff with ice, and her lips cracked from the relentless wind. She was 23 years old and looked twice that. Against her chest, wrapped in what little cloth she had left, her baby girl lay frighteningly still. Rosie had stopped crying hours ago. Her breaths came shallow and uneven, barely stirring the frost along her lashes. Elise had knocked on 3 doors in the last 2 miles, and each rejection had carved another hollow into her heart. The first had said nothing and closed the door. The second had drawn their curtains. The third had shouted for her to leave. Now her legs trembled beneath her. She had nowhere else to go. Through the flurries, a shape rose at the edge of the valley, a cabin dark wood against the white hills, with smoke curling weakly from its chimney. A miracle. She reached the door and knocked. Once, twice, then again her knuckles barely able to lift. The door opened with a creak, and a man filled the frame. Broad-shouldered, stubbled, a lantern in one hand and a shotgun leaning against the wall beside him. His coat was patched from years of use, and his gray eyes were as unreadable as the stone hills behind him. "Please," Elise whispered, her voice breaking on the cold. "Just a piece of bread, enough so I can feed her." The man, Jonah Pike, said nothing. He only looked at the baby in her arms, his gaze lingering for an endless moment. Then, without a word, he began to turn back inside. That single motion split her open. Desperation surged. She dropped to her knees in the snow, tears stinging her wind-burned cheeks. "Wait," she sobbed. "Please, take her, just take her." Her hands shook as she lifted Rosie toward him, shame cutting deeper than the cold. "She deserves a warm home. I can't give her that. I've tried." The words came raw, stripped of all pride. "Please, take her." Jonah stood utterly still. The wind howled between them, rattling the eaves. Then slowly he stepped forward. He slid the shotgun aside, shrugged off his heavy coat, and crouched before her. Gently, he wrapped the coat around mother and child, tucking the folds beneath Elise's chin. His hands were rough but careful. He did not meet her eyes. Then he rose and pushed the door wide. Elise blinked, disbelieving. The sudden rush of warm air struck her like a wave. She tried to stand, her legs wooden. When she stumbled, Jonah caught her elbow steady as stone and guided her inside. The cabin was dim but warm, lit by the glow of a fire that hissed and cracked in the hearth. The heat made her knees weaken again. Jonah moved silently, easing her toward the chair by the fire, his presence solid but distant. Elise's soaked boots thudded to the floor. Steam rose faintly from her clothes. She curled around Rosie, who made no sound. The baby's skin was cold, her tiny lips a pale bluish gray. Fear knifed through Elise's chest. She pressed her cheek to her daughter's head, murmuring nonsense through chattering teeth, as if words could pull her back from the edge. From the shadows at the far end of the cabin came the clink of metal. Jonah reappeared carrying a small iron pot. He set it on the table, and the scent of warm oats drifted through the air. Steam curled from the thin porridge. Beside it, he placed a folded bundle of cloth-clean diapers, worn thin but laundered with care. He said nothing, only crouched near the fire, watching the baby from the corner of his eye. There was no cruelty in his silence, but no comfort either. He seemed carved from the same cold land that surrounded them, scarred, enduring, and impossibly still. Elise's hands trembled as she reached for the spoon. The first mouthful burned her cracked lips, but she swallowed greedily. Between bites she whispered, "I didn't mean to give her away." The words broke apart, thin as smoke. "I just wanted her to have a chance, a warm place, a full belly." Jonah did not answer. He only watched Rosie, his gaze unreadable. Then something flickered there, faint but unmistakable memory. The way his jaw tightened, the slight tremor in his breath. Elise noticed even in her haze. She didn't know that years ago this same hearth had seen another infant nearly die. Jonah had knelt here alone, cradling a newborn son, while the snow sealed the doors, and the doctor never came. His wife had bled out hours after childbirth, her cries fading to silence. He had buried her behind the barn, the shovel slipping on frozen ground. Then he had sat here night after night, whispering prayers he hadn't believed and feeding the fire, like his son's life depended on every spark. Because it had. Elise didn't know any of that. She only saw the man in front of her, silent, immovable, and yet offering her warmth when no one else would. Her tears scalded her cheeks. She bent over Rosie, whose tiny chest rose and fell in fragile rhythm, and whispered, "Please stay with me." Jonah stood slowly. He crossed to a wash basin, wet a cloth with warm water, and handed it to Elise without a word. His eyes were still guarded, but something had shifted. Not much. Just enough to let her breathe. "Thank you," she whispered. He gave a small nod and retreated toward the back room. Elise sat hunched near the fire, trembling, the heavy coat still wrapped around her and Rosie both. She stared into the flames as the storm screamed outside, and for the first time in days the cold stopped winning. When Elise woke, the cabin was quiet, except for the low hiss of the fire and the faint creak of timbers in the wind. Warmth surrounded her, not just from the heavy blanket tucked around her shoulders, but from something softer, less fragile than she remembered warmth could be. For a long moment she didn't move, afraid the peace might vanish if she did. Then Rosie stirred. The baby's cheeks were flushed faintly pink now, her lips parted in tiny even breaths. Relief swept through Elise, so sharp it hurt. She shifted slowly, stiff from exhaustion, and found a folded sweater laid beside her. Worn thin at the elbows, but soft, it smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. Jonah must have left it while she slept. The thought left her strangely hollow and full all at once. She slipped it on sleeves long enough to cover her hands, then sat by the hearth cradling Rosie, soaking in every flicker of life her child showed. From the kitchen came the scrape of a chair and the muffled clatter of iron. Jonah appeared moments later carrying a tin bowl. The steam rose in thin wisps, carrying the smell of potatoes and herbs. He set it on the table without a word, glanced once at the baby, and returned to the stove. Elise hesitated, unsure if it was meant for her. Hunger clawed through her hesitation. She rose, legs shaky, and carried Rosie to the table, settling her in the crook of one arm while she ate with the other. "Thank you," she said softly. Jonah gave a slight nod, but didn't look up from what he was doing. His silence should have felt cold, but somehow it didn't. It was steady like the way the earth held up everything without asking anything in return. For hours the cabin drifted in a gentle rhythm. Elise washed Rosie in warm water Jonah left near the fire, wrapped her in clean cloth from the bundle and held her close as she finally nursed. There was milk now, thin but real, and Rosie's tiny hands fluttered with weak hunger. Elise wept quietly while the child fed. Jonah didn't turn. He sat at the far end of the table carving a block of pine with slow, precise motions, the curl of shavings gathering on the floor around his boots. Later, as dusk thickened the window panes with frost, the cabin door creaked open. A small boy padded inside, clutching a threadbare blanket and blinking sleepily. Blonde hair stuck out in every direction, and his bare feet made soft thuds on the wood. He paused when he saw her. Elise froze, too caught halfway between apology and fear. The boy looked at Rosie, his eyes gray like Jonah's, but bright widened. "She's real small," he said solemnly. Jonah's knife paused. "This is Caleb," he said, the first words Elise had heard from him. His voice was low and gravel rough, like it had forgotten how to be used. Caleb crept closer, eyes round. "Can I hold her?" Elise hesitated. Rosie was still so fragile, but Caleb's hands were steady as he held them out, palms up. Jonah rose, came to her side, and helped ease the baby into his son's arms. Caleb sat cross-legged on the rug, cradling Rosie carefully, as if he'd been born knowing how. "Babies only cry when their bellies are cold," he said matter-of-factly. "I can keep her warm." The words cracked something deep inside Elise. Her throat closed, her eyes burning. "Her name's Rosie," she managed. Caleb grinned. "Hi, Rosie." Jonah watched them both, expression unreadable, but something flickered across his face, a ghost of softness gone almost before she could see it. Elise couldn't stop looking. Caleb hummed under his breath, swaying gently, and Rosie made a soft coo. Not quite a cry. The sound lodged in Elise's chest like sunlight. That night, when Caleb had been tucked into his small bed and the fire burned low, Elise sat at the table while Jonah worked silently on the carving. The storm beat at the shutters, but inside the world had narrowed to the steady scrape of blade on wood and the quiet breathing of her child. "I should tell you," Elise said, finally staring at her hands, "why I came, why I was willing to—" She couldn't finish. Jonah's knife stilled. "His name's Wade," she whispered. "My husband. Or he was." Jonah said nothing, only watched. "He used to be kind." Elise went on the words, catching like splinters. "Before the war, he brought me wildflowers once, sang off-key at our wedding, held me when I was sick. The memories trembled, then turned sharp. But when he came back, he wasn't Wade anymore. Not really. The war took his voice and gave him rage." Her hand drifted to Rosie, sleeping on her lap. He drank to silence it. And when he couldn't, he let it out. She swallowed hard. "He never hit me until after she was born. That night it was snowing hard." He said, "Maybe the cold could teach her silence." Jonah's jaw tightened, his knuckles whitening on the table's edge. "I ran," Elise whispered. "No shoes, no coat, just her. I didn't stop until the town was gone behind me." She forced herself to meet his eyes. "I know what people think, that I stole her, that I'm mad, but I couldn't leave her." For a long moment, Jonah didn't move. Then he turned the block of wood toward her. Words were carved into the surface, crooked but deep, "I understand." Her breath caught. Something inside her wound, tight and hard, loosened a fraction. Hours later, she lay wrapped in quilts on the hearth rug, Rosie tucked against her chest, while Jonah sat on the edge of the table, carving in silence. The room smelled of pine and fire. Outside, the wind howled over the drifts. Inside, for the first time in years, Elise felt like the storm wasn't inside her anymore. The first hint of trouble came not as a shout or knock, but as a voice drifting from the fence line one pale morning as the frost was lifting from the porch rails. Elise was hanging damp linens in the brittle sunlight Rosie bundled close to her chest when the sound made her spine lock. "Well, I'll be damned," the man drawled. A rider sat astride a dappled horse at the edge of the yard, shoulders broad, under a dust-stained coat, his hat pulled low against the glare. He guided the horse forward a few paces, the leather-creaking boots caked in miles of road. "Knew it was you," he said. "Heard rumors, didn't believe them till now." Elise clutched Rosie tighter, her heartbeat stumbling. "Don't remember me, do you?" The man went on, reining in near the porch. "Name's Silas Greeley. I knew Wade, knew you, and I know what you did." "I saved her," Elise said, voice dry as ash. Silas barked a laugh. "You disappeared in the middle of the night with his kid. That's what people say. Lucky it's me who found you and not the law." He leaned forward in the saddle, eyes sharp. "But it will be. Wade's family has money. They'll send letters, hire men. They'll press charges. That baby ain't yours anymore, not after what you pulled." And just like that, he turned his horse and rode off without another word, disappearing into the pale glare beyond the hills. Elise stood rooted, the linens twisting in the cold wind. Rosie stirred faintly against her chest, and that tiny motion broke her paralysis. She ran inside, bolting the door behind her, heart slamming. The walls felt thinner than paper. By nightfall, Silas's warning proved true. A courier on a sorrel mare appeared at the gate, handed Jonah a folded envelope, and rode on without dismounting. Jonah brought it in his face, carved from stone, and placed it on the table. Elise's hands trembled as she broke the wax. The letter bore the seal of the Carter family. The words were formal, cold. "We have been informed that our niece is being held under unlawful circumstances. This will not be ignored. Return the child or face legal consequence." The paper shook in her hands. "They're coming," she whispered. Her voice rose, fraying. "They'll take her from me. I should have run farther. I shouldn't have stayed." She spun, reaching for the small cloth bag she kept hidden beneath the stairs. Jonah stepped into her path. "You don't understand," she gasped. "They'll say I'm mad, that I abandoned Wade, that I'm unfit. I don't have papers or witnesses or—" "Stop." The single word stopped her as if he'd touched her. Jonah crossed to the cabinet by the stove and took down a long wooden box. He set it on the table, opened it, and drew out a rifle. He checked the chamber, slid in a round, and rested it across his arm. Then, in a voice that scraped from somewhere deep and unused, he said, "You're not going anywhere." Elise stared, stunned. "I won't let anyone take your child," he said. "Or you." Her breath hitched. "I can't ask you." "You didn't." He set the rifle near the door and began checking the window latches one by one, his movements calm, methodical. Elise stood frozen, clutching Rosie so tight the baby squirmed. She didn't know whether to cry or collapse. Safety wasn't something she knew how to hold. Jonah moved through the cabin like a slow tide, sealing gaps in the shutters, reinforcing the door frame, setting iron bars across the cellar entrance. By the time he finished, dusk had thickened, and the lanterns cast pools of gold across the floor. Elise watched from the hearth, tangled in knots she didn't have words for. She'd expected him to turn her out to choose safety over risk. Instead, he had chosen them, and the world seemed to notice. 2 days later, Mrs. Thompson, who ran the general store, stopped her on the road to town. The older woman's face, once sharp with suspicion, was softer now. Without a word, she pressed a parcel wrapped in muslin into Elise's hands. Inside was fresh bread, still warm from the oven, and a small tin of lard. For the little one, she said simply, then walked away before Elise could answer. 3 mornings after that, the widow alder trudged slowly up the ranch path through melting drifts. She said nothing as she set down a cloth sack on the porch, only gave a single curt nod and turned to go. "Wait," Elise called, stepping outside. The old woman paused, one gloved hand on the gate. "Why?" Elise asked softly. Widow Alder didn't turn. Her shoulders rose and fell with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of years. "Because it ain't the baby's fault," she said, "and it sure as hell ain't yours." Then she walked away, boots crunching in the slush. Inside the sack were knitted blankets, a jar of honey, a tin of salve for cracked skin, and at the very bottom, a tiny bonnet sewn of soft blue cotton, stitched by hand. Elise held it to her chest and sank onto the steps, trembling. Behind her, the ranch creaked gently in the warming breeze. Jonah was in the yard sleeves, rolled driving cedar posts into the ground along the fence line. He paused when he saw her, gave a single nod, and kept working. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't approval, but it was something like belonging rising slow as the thaw. The wind had a bitter edge that day, sharp enough to sting through the cracks around the windows. Elise was rocking Rosie near the hearth, humming an old lullaby her mother used to sing when the sound of hoofbeats broke the quiet. They came fast, hard, and wrong, too heavy to be a passing rider, too urgent to be the mail. She rose, heart-thudding, clutching Rosie close. Through the front window, a lone figure swayed in the saddle shoulders, hunched coat whipping in the cold wind. Even before his face came into view, her stomach knew. Wade. He rode like a man, half dead, but burning with something feral. His eyes were wild, his jaw unshaven, and a pistol hung low on his belt. When his horse stopped at the porch, he didn't dismount. He bellowed, voice ragged from whiskey and rage. "Elise, I know you're in there," Rosie whimpered. Elise stepped back, pulse roaring in her ears. "You think you can just run off, take what's mine? My wife, my kid." He swung down from the saddle, stumbled up the steps, and slammed his fists on the door. "Open this door, or I'll tear it off the hinges." Elise grabbed a chair and wedged it under the handle. Her fingers fumbled at the lock, but it was too late. Wade shoved his shoulder against the wood twice until the frame splintered. On the third hit, the door burst inward. Cold wind howled through the opening. Wade lurched inside, eyes bloodshot and blazing. "You're coming with me," he hissed, seizing her wrist. "No," she cried, twisting away, shielding Rosie with her body. "Don't fight me," he roared, yanking her so hard she stumbled to her knees. Rosie wailed high and panicked. Elise curled over her, refusing to let go. Then came another sound, distant but fast. Hooves pounding the frozen ground like thunder. Wade froze, head snapping toward the door. The front gate slammed open. Jonah. He was off his horse before it stopped moving, boots striking the ground in a blur of motion. His face was stone, his rifle already in his hands. Wade snatched for his pistol. The shot cracked through the cabin, splintering the doorframe. Elise flinched. Jonah didn't miss. His bullet slammed into Wade's shoulder, spinning him backward with a scream. The gun clattered across the floor. Wade hit the boards, howling, clutching his bleeding arm. Jonah was on him in an instant, kicking the pistol away, then binding his wrists behind his back with a length of leather cord torn from his saddle. Wade thrashed and cursed, but Jonah didn't say a word. His silence was more terrifying than any threat. He hauled Wade upright like he weighed nothing and dragged him outside into the cold. Elise staggered to her feet, clutching Rosie. Through the open door, she watched Jonah tie Wade to his own horse's saddle, the wounded man still spitting fury. Jonah mounted and turned toward the distant rise where the town waited. Not once did he look back. The ride into town was slow, deliberate. The bound man slumped and bleeding. By the time Jonah reached Main Street, word had spread. Shopkeepers stepped from their doorways. Mothers hushed their children. The sheriff waited on the steps of his office, hands resting on his belt. Jonah swung down, boots crunching on the packed dirt. He dragged Wade from the saddle and let him drop in the street. Then he lifted his head, and his gravel-deep voice carried through the hushed crowd. This man tried to kill a child. A ripple went through the onlookers. A woman gasped. Someone spat in the dust. The sheriff knelt, checked Wade's wound, and stood with a grim nod. "We'll take it from here." They hauled Wade away, still cursing, still struggling, but no one listened anymore. At the edge of the street, half hidden behind the rise, Elise stood clutching Rosie. Jonah turned and found her eyes. He didn't smile. He only gave a single steady nod. She nodded back, tears clinging to her lashes. By the end of the week, the whispers in town had changed their tune. The same mouths that once muttered about scandal now spoke of something else, respect, regret even. Mrs. Thompson at the general store no longer averted her gaze. She offered a quiet smile. Widow Alder sent more supplies without comment. People who used to cross the street to avoid Elise now tipped their hats when she passed with Rosie strapped to her chest. The scandal was gone. All that remained was the story, how Jonah Pike, the silent widower, had ridden into town with a bound man bleeding from the shoulder, declaring him a threat to a mother and her child, and how Elise, pale but unflinching, had stood beyond the rise and watched justice walk away in irons. It spread from porch to parlor, from dry goods counter to church pew, growing with each retelling. And at the ranch, silence settled again, not the brittle silence of fear, but something steadier, something that sounded almost like peace. By early March, winter had loosened its grip. The snow shrank back into the shadows of fences and rocks, leaving behind patches of damp earth that steamed faintly in the morning sun. The air smelled of thawing pine and wet soil, and the sharp bite of the wind had softened into something almost gentle. Chickens scratched at the muddy ground near the barn, clucking as though astonished to see the earth again. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, not desperate anymore, just comforting. Inside the cabin no longer felt like a shelter against a siege. It felt like a home. Rosie had grown rounder in the cheeks, her cries louder and stronger. Each time Caleb knelt by her cradle with a book, she kicked wildly and squealed, as if she understood every word. He had taken to reading to her in the same deep, careful tone. Jonah used his small fingers, tracing the pictures with fierce concentration. Once upon a time, he would say with exaggerated solemnity, and then giggle when Rosie grabbed the page with her fists. Jonah had changed too. Words that once came, rarely now surfaced more often, halting at first as though unused muscles were learning their shape, but steadier every day. He spoke to Caleb about chores to Rosie and low murmurs as he held her, and sometimes to Elise as they worked side by side, shelling beans or mending clothes. The sound of his voice no longer startled her. It felt like part of the house, like the crackle of the fire or the creak of the floorboards. One afternoon, Elise stepped onto the porch with a mug of tea cupped between her palms. The land stretched wide before her hills, mottled with patches of green and brown where the snow had surrendered. Buds dusted the trees along the ridge. For the first time in years, she felt her breath come all the way to the bottom of her lungs without catching. The stillness no longer pressed on her like a threat. It wrapped around her like a blanket. Behind her, the cabin door opened with a soft creak. She didn't turn. She felt him before she saw him. Jonah moved quietly, the way mountains cast shadows solid and inevitable. He stood beside her for a moment looking out over the fields. Then he placed something in her hands. It was a small plaque, hand-carved, the edges smoothed with care. The words etched into it were uneven, the letters slightly crooked, but they were unmistakable. Family is something no one can take from you. Elise stared at it, her vision blurring. She didn't cry. She had shed too many tears in the cold, when tears only froze and burned. Instead, she leaned back just enough for his arm to come around her waist. The warmth of him was steady, quiet, sure. I believe that she whispered. Later that day, they sat together on the front steps as the sun slid behind the hills, spilling gold over the fields. Elise cradled Rosie in her arms. Jonah sat close enough for their shoulders to brush Caleb sprawled across his knee, with a heel of bread sticky with honey. Rosie slept with one tiny hand curled in the collar of Elise's shirt. The air hummed with the soft sound of crickets and the distant trickle of meltwater. No one spoke. They didn't need to. They had survived the storm. Not just winter, not just Wade, but the kind of storm that tries to erase a person's place in the world. They had held on long enough to build something new, not through grand declarations, but through quiet acts. A coat wrapped around shivering shoulders, a rifle placed by the door, a boy's small arms holding a baby with fierce tenderness, a man who spoke little, showing with his hands what his voice couldn't. It wasn't luck that saved them, it was choice. Every day choosing each other. And that is the lesson this story leaves behind, that family isn't something you stumble upon by chance. It's something you build board by board, moment by moment, even when the wind howls and the world wants to take it from you. If this story stirred something in you, if your heart clenched when she offered her baby for bread, and if you found yourself breathing easier when she finally found warmth, then tell us what part struck you most in the comments. And if you believe, as they did, that love can rise even from silence and scars, then subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, where each week we bring you new tales of untamed hearts and fierce devotion. Because even in the coldest storms, love is the fire that never dies.